Smoke blackened the sky.
The Babylonian soldiers marched thousands of broken Hebrew captives
Across a brutal, unforgiving desert toward an empire they had only heard of in nightmares.
Chains dragged against the cracked earth, echoing with a hollow, metallic rhythm.
Hope was dead.
The smell of burning cedar from Solomon's temple still clung to their torn garments, a suffocating reminder of everything they had lost. The iron shackles bit into their wrists, cold and unyielding.
What do you do when the God who promised to protect you lets the enemy burn your home to the ground?
In a few moments, an exiled priest named Ezekiel will sit by a foreign river. And what he witnesses in that divine storm will change the way you look at every global crisis.
Every political tremor, and every war rumor in your own lifetime.
If you want to understand the ancient blueprints of human history, subscribe to the channel.
And walk with us into the terrifying visions of the prophets. The year was 593 BC. The River Kebar cut through the Babylonian landscape like a muddy scar. Ezekiel sat among the exiles.
The atmosphere was heavy, with the silence of a defeated people. A crushing, suffocating despair that settled deep in the chest. The exiles wept.
They hung their harps on the willow trees, refusing to sing the songs of Zion in a pagan wasteland. The temple was gone. Not because the Babylonian gods were stronger. Not because Yahweh had forgotten his covenant.
But because the protection of the Almighty is never a license for rebellion.
The truth is, the fire that consumed Jerusalem was simply the
That had existed for generations.
Ezekiel stared at the stagnant water. The wind began to change.
It didn't start as a gentle breeze.
It began as an unnatural, violent roaring from the north. The temperature plummeted instantly, turning the sweat on Ezekiel's neck to ice. A massive cloud rolled across the horizon, flashing with continuous, blinding fire. Brilliant light surrounded it, glowing like molten metal in the heart of a furnace.
Ezekiel fell face down in the dirt.
The mud pressed against his lips. Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. The voice was not a sound. It was an earthquake that rattled the marrow in his bones. The Spirit entered him, lifting him to his feet.
God was not constrained to the ruins of Jerusalem.
The creator of the cosmos had crossed the desert,
Stepped into the very heart of enemy territory and descended upon a captive priest.
but God had not come to speak about Babylon.
Babylon was merely a temporary instrument of discipline, a hammer in the hand of the builder.
God was pulling back the curtain on the distant future. He was showing Ezekiel the final culmination of human history.
The gathering storm that would not break for thousands of years.
He pointed Ezekiel's spiritual eyes far beyond the immediate horizon, toward the dark mountains of the north and the ancient highlands of the east.
Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal.
The names echoed in the spiritual realm, ancient and full of malice.
But then, another name was spoken.
A name that sent a chill through the prophetic timeline.
Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets.
Persia, the ancient land of Elam. At that exact moment in history, Persia was not a superpower. They were a secondary kingdom, overshadowed by the massive Babylonian war machine. To the exiles weeping by the river, Persia was a distant thought,
A rugged territory far to the east.
Ezekiel could not fully comprehend the timeline. He saw the shadows of armored men stretching across the sands of time. Heard the deafening roar of millions of boots marching in unison. The horrific grinding of a military coalition so massive it defied ancient understanding. God was revealing an unholy alliance. Nations that had nothing in common, cultures separated by vast oceans and mountain ranges,
suddenly united by a single supernatural hatred. A coalition from the uttermost north, joining forces with the ancient empire of Persia, marching down upon a land that had recovered from war.
Why would the Almighty reveal a war involving Persia to a man who would die centuries before it happened?
Because prophecy is not just prediction. It is a declaration of absolute sovereignty.
While Ezekiel trembled by the river, another prophet was stationed in the very heart of the Persian territory.
Hundreds of miles away, in the fortified citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam, Daniel stood by the Ulai Canal. The air in Elam was thick, smelling of exotic spices and impending bloodshed. Daniel looked up. He saw a ram with two massive horns standing beside the canal. One horn was longer than the other, and the longer one grew up later.
The ram charged violently toward the west, the north, and the south. No animal could stand against it.
The ram was the kings of Media and Persia.
Two prophets. Two different locations. One horrifying, unified vision of a future where the territory of modern-day Iran would become the epicenter of a geopolitical earthquake. Ezekiel saw them marching in the final days. Daniel saw the spiritual forces fighting behind their political thrones. The prophets were not looking at military generals.
They were staring directly at the ancient, demonic principalities that drive nations to madness.
They were staring directly at the ancient, demonic principalities that drive nations to madness. The ancient territory of Elam was waking up. And the world had no idea what was coming.
Everything was about to change.
The earth shook beneath the ancient prophecies. Before Ezekiel saw the final northern coalition, God had already painted a bullseye on the ancient lands of Iran. Look closely at Jeremiah, chapter 49. In the opening years of Zedekiah's doomed reign in Jerusalem, before the final Babylonian destruction, God spoke directly concerning Elam.
At the height of its pride, God pronounced its fate.
I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might.
It was a surgical strike against their greatest weapon.
And then came the terrifying promise that God would scatter the Elamites to the four winds.
But God never crushes a nation purely for destruction.
He breaks to rebuild. He destroys to reveal.
Tucked at the very end of Jeremiah's oracle is a startling promise. Yet in the days to come, I will restore the fortunes of Elam, declares the Lord.
But that future is a collision course with destiny.
Years later, Ezekiel, standing by the river, began to see the pieces coming together.
The restored nations. A world that believes it has found peace.
A prosperous Israel dwelling safely, without walls or iron gates. It was an illusion of safety. God pointed Ezekiel's gaze to the north. A vast black shadow began to form over the mountains of Magog.
It was a coalition of nations rising from the ashes of history.
Not a small guerrilla force, an organized, overwhelming military machine.
You will advance, coming on like a storm.
You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your troops, and many peoples with you.
Ezekiel watched as the dark tide began to flow southward. And then he saw the flags, the banners of nations joining the march.
The text is horrifyingly specific. God didn't just say, a great army. He named them.
He named them Meshech and Tubal, Put from the west, Cush from the distant south, Gomer and the house of Togarmah from the far north.
An impossible alliance.
Nations that have spent millennia slaughtering each other, united by a singular, demonic purpose.
And right there, among the marching hordes, was Persia.
The ancient Elamites. Ezekiel could almost feel the vibration of their advance. The air smelled of iron and dust. They came riding horses, fully armed, wielding swords and shields.
A massive, unyielding wall of destruction. It wasn't just a physical assault.
It was a calculated, spiritual operation designed to wipe the name of God's people from the earth forever.
The prophet watched as the invading forces crossed the borders.
They poured over the mountains like a swarm of locusts, darkening the skies.
The cities below offered no resistance. They were soft. They had forgotten how to fight.
They trusted in treaties and global alliances, ignoring the ancient warnings written in the blood of their ancestors. Fear coiled like a snake in Ezekiel's chest. The sheer scale of the attack was paralyzing. No human army could stop them.
No political negotiation could turn them back.
It was checkmate. The end of days was unfolding before his eyes.
And it looked exactly like total, utter annihilation.
The promise of God seemed to be on the verge of being swallowed whole by the overwhelming force of the enemy. The exiles by the river waited in breathless silence.
They could see the terror etched onto Ezekiel's face.
The burden of the vision was pressing down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs.
The final act was beginning.
He thought he knew suffering. He was wrong.
The earth groaned beneath the weight of the invaders.
To understand the sheer magnitude of the terror Ezekiel saw,
You must understand the geography of survival. Israel was a fragile strip of land, a tiny bridge between the sea and the desert.
There was no retreating. No secondary line of defense.
When a storm rolled in from the north, it swept across the entire nation until it crashed against the mountains of Jerusalem.
and this storm was completely unprecedented.
God deliberately highlighted the vulnerability of his people.
He called it a land of unwalled villages.
You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages.
I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people. In the ancient world, a city without walls was a dead city. It meant the inhabitants were either entirely foolish or absolutely secure.
For a brief moment in the prophetic timeline, Israel felt secure.
But the enemy saw only weakness.
To Gog, the leader of the Magog coalition, Israel wasn't a military threat. It was a bank vault left wide open.
Ezekiel watched the psychological warfare unfold.
The text reveals the enemy's motivation. It wasn't just hatred, it was greed.
They came to capture spoil and to seize plunder.
Imagine standing in a valley as the first wave of the Persian and Northern coalition crests the ridge.
The sound alone would be paralyzing. A deafening, mechanical roar of armor.
The thunder of countless hooves and the terrifying, guttural war cries.
Of nations whose languages you don't even understand.
The sky grew dark with dust. The heat of their march was stifling.
The prophets of the Old Testament often used the concept of the day of the Lord to describe moments of absolute, inescapable judgment. But this felt different. This wasn't discipline. This was an extermination protocol.
The coalition forces didn't just march, they surrounded.
They cut off the trade routes. They choked the water supplies.
The psychological pressure mounted as the horizon filled with the banners
Of Gog, Persia, Cush, and Put.
Every direction you looked, the enemy was waiting.
Fear is a contagion.
When you are outnumbered 10 to 1, faith often feels like a fragile, ridiculous luxury.
What do you do when God allows the enemy to surround you on every side?
You look to the sky.
In the physical realm, there was no hope.
The armies of the earth had allied against a people who had laid down their weapons.
The text says they came like a cloud covering the land.
The sheer number of soldiers blotted out the sun.
The shadow of death fell over the unwalled villages.
But the enemy made a fatal miscalculation.
They assumed that because Israel had no physical walls, they had no defense.
They believed the silence of heaven was evidence of God's absence.
They forgot the ancient promise made to Elam.
They forgot that the God who promised to break the bow of Elam in Jeremiah's time
was the same God who watched their every move now. The tension in Ezekiel's vision reached a breaking point.
The invading armies drew their swords.
The final command to slaughter was about to be given.
The destruction of Israel seemed inevitable, a mere historical footnote waiting to be written by the victors.
The silence was a weight.
The breath caught in the throat of every exile listening to Ezekiel's words.
This was the darkest hour.
The moment right before the world ends. But then, God spoke.
And history itself shuddered.
The siege was complete. The trap was set.
The massive coalition, stretching from the Persian frontier to the high mountains of Magog,
had perfectly surrounded the land.
They had the weapons, they had the numbers, and they had the element of absolute surprise.
Israel stood helpless, a flock waiting for the slaughter in the Valley of Decision.
But the enemy made one critical mistake.
They believed they were writing the script. They thought the invasion was their idea.
They didn't realize they had been summoned.
Look carefully at the text of Ezekiel 38.
God didn't merely permit the invasion. He triggered it.
Long before the first sword was drawn, God spoke directly to Gog. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army. It was an ambush. But the ambush wasn't set for Israel. The ambush was set for the coalition.
The armies of Persia, Put, Cush, and the entire Northern Alliance
were not storming the gates of victory. They were marching blindly into a divine execution chamber. God had allowed the enemy to gather in one place, not to hand them the prize, but to break them completely and publicly.
Ezekiel watched the skies above the mountains of Israel. The atmosphere,
The silence of heaven was broken, not by the sound of an angelic army, but by a sound far more terrifying.
The raw, unfiltered wrath of the Almighty.
The text says that God's hot anger was aroused in his face.
It was the jealous rage of a king, watching his people be surrounded by thieves.
Suddenly, the earth beneath the invading armies turned into liquid terror.
in my zeal and fiery wrath I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel.
It wasn't a minor tremor. It was a global cataclysm.
The mountains collapsed. The steep cliffs crumbled.
Every wall, every tower, every structure of human pride fell to the ground.
The sheer force of the earthquake threw the invading forces into absolute chaos.
The formation of the great army disintegrated in seconds.
Horses panicked, trampling riders beneath iron hooves. Then came the darkness. The skies opened, but not with rain. God unleashed the arsenal of creation itself. Torrents of rain, massive hailstones, burning sulfur, and fire rained down.
Upon the troops of Gog and Persia.
The weapons they had forged for conquest melted in their hands.
The very elements of the earth fought against them.
Panic spread like a virus.
Blinded by the fire and deafened by the collapsing earth, the coalition turned on itself.
The alliance that had seemed so invincible moments before devolved into a slaughterhouse. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord.
Every man's sword will be against his brother.
This was the revelation. This is what the world did not understand. God did not need an army to defend his land. He did not need a treaty or an alliance. He needed the enemy to step onto his territory so he could make a statement that would echo through eternity.
The smoke cleared over the mountains.
The vast, terrifying machine of the Northern Alliance lay completely destroyed. Not a single arrow had been fired by the unwalled villages. The war was over before the people of Israel even had to fight.
But why? Why this display of overwhelming, terrifying power?
Here's what they never tell you about the end of days. The ultimate purpose of the final war is not survival. It is revelation. Because Ezekiel 38 reveals the true heartbeat of the Creator.
And so I will show my greatness and my holiness,
and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations.
Then they will know that I am the Lord.
God didn't just break the bow of Elam. He broke the illusion of human supremacy. The final result was not a cemetery, but a sanctuary. Every nation that had marched in hatred was now forced to look at the truth.
Ezekiel was no longer just a captive priest in a foreign land.
He was a witness to the end of all human empires. The coalition of Magog and Persia was gone. A new day was breaking over the exile. The mountains of Israel were restored. Peace had returned, not through a treaty, but through a triumph. Ezekiel and Daniel, two perspectives, one sovereign God.
The maps of the world have changed many times since that day.
But the spiritual gears of the universe remain exactly the same.
Ezekiel lived out his days in exile.
His body was in Babylon, but his spirit was in the presence of the king.
He knew the secret that every believer must eventually learn.
Kings will rise. Empires will boast.
The noise of their chariots will fade into the silence of the dust. But the word of the Lord stands forever. In a world that feels increasingly out of control,
Where the names of Elam and Magog appear in the headlines.
Remember the vision of the captive priest.
the darkness is real. The threat is massive.
But the trap is already set for the pride of man.
The king is on his throne.
The timing is perfect.
The outcome is already written. You are safe in the hands of the one who broke the... He has never lost a battle.
He has never forgotten a promise.
He is the Lord of history. The end is not destruction. The end is the beginning of the King's reign.
A peace that nothing on this earth can shake.
The power of the enemy is dust. The glory of God is everything. Rest in the truth. Stand in the light. And walk without fear. The storm will pass. The noise will end. Only the truth will remain.
Take heart. The King is coming.
His kingdom is forever.
Victory is written in the stars.